attuned to the world, or I'm not attuned to my parents. Kind of a proto-attachment theory, right? The world's not attuned to me. So I tell myself a sentence. It's the way my attention fixates in a particular sentence. And the sentence might be, I'm not enough. Or the sentence might be, I'm not worthy. Or the sentence might be, I'm too much, right? Or the sentence might be, I'm alone. Or the sentence might be, I'm not safe. I was flying back with a wonderful woman who actually was killed a number of years ago, died tragically young, but she was on her way to her wedding. And it was very, very clear to me that she was on her way to the wedding to marriage to the wrong person. And, I certainly wasn't going to share that information.
Mm.
And we didn't know each other well. She wasn't my student. She was a student of a friend of mine. But, I did a false self exercise with her. And in the exercise, I listed for her, a list of, 20 possibilities. I'm not enough. I'm too much. I'm not safe. I'm alone, right? I'm not competent, right? Etc. And the one she chose was, I'm too much. And of course, she was marrying someone who she felt could actually, contain her being I'm too much and package her and make her safe for the world because I was too much. So when you're living in other words, I would say if someone asked me, gun to my head, and that's what I call your false core sentence, right? And when I say I call, it's really a Chazos. I've developed it in certain ways. Gilligan has developed in other ways. There's a number of theorists who've done important work. This guy named Walensky did important work here. And by the way, it's important just even quickly to cite people because we draw from people and we have to honor them, right? So mine's probably I'm not safe. Probably I'm not safe, some version of I'm not safe. So when you have a false core sentence, you live and you generate reality from within that sentence, right? And so either you go try and validate, right, your false core sentence, right? Or you go to try and protect against it. You make one of two moves, right? So you might, if your sentence is I'm not safe, you might take risks, or you might not take risks at all, right? There's different ways to do it.
Or armor up.
Or armor up, right? There's lots of
Yeah.
ways to do it, right?
Right.
Right. I did it by taking risks, right? So that was my right. And you got to make sure that it's the right risk. But in any case, for our purposes, meaning I generate reality from within. I'm not safe, and I develop a false self, right? Which is the person I generate in order to cover up my false core. I'm not safe, and it's not that my false self is completely wrong. It's actually right in a lot of ways, but it's not actually rooted on the ground because I'm living within a false core sentence. That's just an example. It's not our topic today. It's an example of, a false self, meaning there's particular ways that the false self distorts. There's ways the separate self distorts as false self. And it's really important to do work. And I want to honor the therapeutic world. The therapeutic world has great limitations, but it also has great gifts, right? And actually, the therapeutic world works at the level of separate self and particularly can work effectively in different modalities at dealing with different forms of false self. And so most therapy is at the realm of separate self, false self, does work there. It's not the prepersonal realm. Prepersonal realm is a certain kind of intense kind of, deal. It requires, forms of almost hospitalization. It's mental breakdown. But within the realm of the quote unquote normal spectrum, although norm is kind of the name of someone who lives in Brooklyn, right? In other words, there is no real norm. It's a little bit of an illusion. But therapy works there, and it's important there. It's an important tool. It's a limited tool. So there's the pre-personal, right? Then we get to the personal. The personal has separate self and false self, right? And that's what we would normally call the realm of personality or the personal. That's how it's normally called. We'll see that's actually only level 1 personal. From there, drum roll, right? So we got pre-personal self. We got separate self. We talked about its light and shadow. We've got now false self, which is a puzzle piece that's a little crumpled up, right?
Yeah.
It's a crumpled up puzzle piece. Now we go to true self. Okay? Right? So true self, right? True self is a great momentous leap in consciousness. It's insanely important. It's thought to be by many traditions the whole story. It's not, and we got to spend a little time on true self. So we talked about Western enlightenment that says, oh, what's the big deal? Separate self. Separate self heals suffering, right? Separate self responds to the pre-modern period, which says you're just part of a community. No, you're a separate self. That's the beginning of human dignity. That heals suffering. That's Western Enlightenment. Along comes Eastern Enlightenment and says the exact opposite, which is why people are hopelessly confused, right? The Eastern Enlightenment says, no, no, that thing you're calling separate self, that Western Enlightenment where you grew up said heals suffering and it's the beginning of your dignity and the beginning of a thriving and flourishing life. No, that's the source of all suffering.
Mm.
That thing that Western Enlightenment, right, told you was the root of human dignity and ended all the previous suffering. That's the beginning of progress in the Western Enlightenment. No, no, no. Eastern Enlightenment says, which lives all through the Western world today, Eastern Enlightenment says, no, no, that's completely wrong. That's actually the source of suffering, your separate self. Your separate self is a complete illusion. It's only a myth of separation, right? Your separate self is something you need to move beyond and actually get to your true self. And what's your true self? Your true self is the realization that I am one with the field, right? I'm not separate from the field. It's sometimes even called no self, called no self or true self, right? And that is my enlightened self, the way it's described by Eastern Enlightenment. And it's absolutely true, but partial. But let's get the truth first. Means I realize that my true self is inseparable from the field of consciousness. I'm one with the field of consciousness, and the total number of true selves in the world is one. So true self is the singular that has no plural, Schrodinger's phrase. Total number of true selves in the world, one, right? I'm not separate from the field, right? The Zen joke about, the hot dog stand's not completely wrong. Make me one with everything, right? Okay, we're on, right? So that's true self. And that is a beautiful, accurate, true, exists in every great tradition, some version of it. That's a momentous leap in consciousness. I'm actually part of the field.
And when you experience this, again, as an experiential,
Please.
Psychonaut, this is that moment of what you would call apotheosis, where you merge with the field. It feels like God. And so you use that language, and there's not really another language you can do. It's either the kind of energetic yang transmission of the divine, which is everything, or it's the yin transmission of the divine, which is nothing, where you become the void, empty of all things,
right,
or full of
Beautiful.
all things. And that could happen, 5-MeO-DMT Bufo ceremonies tend to bring you to the everything version, all
Right.
of ecstasy, joy, pain, orgasm, bliss, love, laughter, all at the same time, screaming so loudly and purely that everything merges into the one sound, the one light, the one taste, the one everything, and it's just oneness. And that's beautiful because it recalibrates everything and lets you know, like, oh wow, this is real. This is real. And then there's the void, in certain ways with ketamine can actually bring you into this void state where you are just empty of all contents, and all contents are possible, but none have manifested. And you can find both different versions of this kind of oneness.
Right.
And there's almost different faces of the oneness, but it's
very-
still the one.
That's very, and you just described very elegantly a psychedelic approach to true self, right? Which is one that you're deeply versed in. I'm not. And I appreciate the description, and your description is well validated from my own practice through, ecstatic modes of prayer, ecstatic modes of chant, meditative modes, right, of realization, where in my own attainment, you actually have a direct experience of true self. And it has, as you say, but you describe both of those qualities actually appear both in my own experience and in the great traditions.
Yep.
So it's an accurate reflection. It's beautiful actually for me to hear the psychedelic, right, road into those two faces of true self, which is a kind of a void emptiness state. It's empty of anything that's not absolutely full, right? It's shunyata, right? And a kind of a one with the entire field, right? Nothing left out, but you feel the utter realness of the field.
Yep.
So it's not like you've left the realm of the real. You've actually entered the realm of the real. You're in the absolutely real. So you are one with the field of reality, and you invoked a term, a good term, which I talk about in the Unique Self book a little bit, but more in a scholarly work that I did at Oxford called Radical Kabbalah. You talked about apotheosis. It's an important word. Apotheosis is, as you correctly said, to be one with God, and you quickly, right, did a little turn, and a correct turn. I just want to point it out because it was so quick, which is you were talking there God not as the creator God exterior from reality.
Yep.
You were talking about God as the field.
Yep.
Right, which is more of a kind of interior science mystical view of God. God who's late atar panui mine in Aramaic. There's nothing devoid of she. Right, God is the field. So when you talk about God as the field, right, that kind of apotheosis, this kind of merger with the field, this union, right, with the field, I'm one with the field, right, that's a beautiful description of true self. So true self is, now this is really important, true self is an absolute reality. It's validated by the interior sciences. It's not a myth, right? It's empirically validated by realizers of the most subtle and speculative mind hearts throughout history, right? When we collected the testimonies of practitioners throughout history, all separated from each other in space and time, when in the last 150 years we collected those testimonies, it actually turned out that they all had slightly different methodologies, practices, or yogas, right? First practices to get to this realization, but they all got to the same place, give or take, different tastes of this one taste. Buddhists call this one taste. One taste has quite a few different culinary expressions, but it's basically one taste. And that's an absolutely valid, real, and the perennial philosophy, right, which emerges in the Renaissance that Aldous Huxley wrote a book by that name about, right, describes this true self as the be-all, end-all of the whole story. Even Maslow, at the end of his life, in the last couple of years before he dies, writes in his diary when he was staying at Esalen, the retreat center, which my friend Michael Murphy owns on the West Coast, right? He talked about kind of his first realization, oh, there's a true self there. He began to get a sense of that. Now, here's the problem. Okay, here we go. Okay, here's the problem. True self is true but partial, right? And this is a very big deal. When I first started to say this out loud, my colleagues in the world of kind of classical attainment thought, oh, right, clearly Gafni has no attainment, right? Because he's challenged, right? And that was the reigning dogma I had with my friend Ken Wilber. And Ken's a gorgeous integrator and a dear friend. We had, maybe 2-3 years of fierce contestation, right, on this issue. And because the assumption was that any claim, right, that true self is not the end of the story, right, is based on some inferior realization, right? You're not realized, you're confused. And I wrote a book called Soul Prince, where I kind of alluded to in a number of places in that book, to a state, beyond true self, right, a higher level of self, right? But I didn't explicate it. I gave it to my friend Ken, and Ken said, oh, it's a great book, but, I'm not moved. I said, okay. So I get that, motherfucker, right? And Ken's fantastic, right? We had just a gorgeous time here, and in a million conversations, and we've managed over the last 15, 17 years for as much as we can, the last decade, to try and talk every week and spend a few hours kind of in the Dharma together. And so I said, okay, let me write a little bit more on you. Let me write you a little bit of a note on this. So I wrote about 1,500 pages. I went to Oxford, and I was giving lectures then in Jerusalem. It's a little autobiography just for a quick second to locate it. And through those lectures, there was someone at the lectures whose husband was a key professor named Moshe Idel. He's kind of the leading scholar of Kabbalah. He has a fantastic wife who would come to lecture, Shoshana. And Moshe said to me, this work's important, but you should get a doctorate. I had little value for the academy, which I kind of felt was a kind of center of mediocrity where there was not a lot of original thought. And Moshe said, get it anyways, right? And I'd taken like 5 or 6 doctoral topics until that point and exhausted the topic, kind of reading everything about it. And then being done with it, why would I bother to write about it? I'm done. And Moshe kind of made the point that the point is to actually get the doctorate. I said, oh, good point. So I went to Oxford, and Moshe was my advisor, and he's beautiful man. I sat in the Oxford Library for about a year and a half, as I was teaching. But when I was in Oxford, I found the one library that was open 24 hours a day, and I would go like 20-hour stretches, and wrote about 1,500 pages, which I sent to Ken. And in the end, became a doctorate. They only accepted 300 pages, and when I went to my doctoral exam, they just wanted to give him the doctorate, get him out of here as fast as we can, because they weren't reading the texts well, and they were. But blessings to Oxford, and My mother, by the way, is very happy. I went to Oxford. My son, he went to Oxford, right? So, and this is a big deal. So Ken, to his great and beautiful, integrity, credit, he read it through in a few nights, marked it all up. He started passing it around. My friend Zach Stein, right? And Zach has studied with me for 12, 13 years, and Zach's written brilliant work that actually is about unique self, which we'll talk about a little later. Zach read the marked up copy of it, and like Ken got it. He said, "Oh, okay, I got it," and it was a description of this lineage of unique self, right? And it was based on a number of things, and I'm going to start in the beginning. One is there's this fundamental confusion between separateness and uniqueness. Okay, so this is a very, very big deal, and we begin to see the limit of true self. Because what true self does is, and I'm going to take this slow because we're going to kind of slow down, right? You move too fast. We got this exactly right. When we get this, it's going to help a lot. So we pointed out earlier that there's Western Enlightenment and Eastern Enlightenment. They're both called themselves Enlightenment, and they both actually have precisely contradictory principles. Western Enlightenment says we want to alleviate suffering. We're going to do it by realizing that who you are is separate self. That's where dignity lives. That's the ground of human flourishing. Eastern Enlightenment says, no, separate self is the ground of suffering, right? The ground of human flourishing is to move beyond separate self and to get to true self. So both of those, right? Bless you, Christian, right? Both of those, right, are true but partial, and they're based on a confusion between separateness and uniqueness. This is a very big deal. So Eastern Enlightenment says, wow, your separateness gets you in trouble. That's true. The experience of separateness gets you in trouble. I'm separate from the field, and it's not true. Mm-hmm. But my uniqueness is not my separateness, because there's a seamless code of the universe, but it's seamless but not featureless. It's filled with unique, distinct features. So you're part of the seamless code of the universe, but you're also its irreducibly unique and distinct feature. So actually, I can move beyond my separate self. I can realize that I'm part of the true self, but that true self actually doesn't exist any place in the fucking manifest world. There is no true self any place in the manifest world. You're never going to meet a true self, not at a restaurant, not at a bar, not late at night, not early in the morning, not on a walk, ever. There's no true self in the manifest world, because every true self sees through a unique set of eyes.
Yeah, a unique perspective. And even as I talk about my own psychonautic journeys,
yes,
right? The mere fact that I can recount what happened, I went to the void, I went to the everything,
is unique self
is a unique
peering
perspective.
Out.
Yeah, exactly.
And you put in perspective. So an early equation that I formulated with Ken is true self plus perspective equals unique self. That's an early equation. We're going to update it today, but that's an early equation we formulated early on. It's in the first, major unique self work, the Your Unique Self book, which is the classical book that I think you talked about in the intro to the dialogue. And we talk about this equation: true self plus unique perspective equals unique self. And you have an irreducible unique perspective, meaning you're at a unique place in the time-space continuum that no one else that ever was, is, or will be is. So you have a unique perspective, and that's never effaced by your true self. So you've got a unique perspective. That's a very, very big deal. Now, not only do I have a unique perspective, but I also have a unique quality of intimacy. In other words, if there's four of us, there's how many of us in this room? Four of us, okay? So we've got Mark and Aubrey and Ryan and Christian. If we did a little, pointing out instruction, I would say, pull up the unique test. I say to Christian, pull up the unique taste of Mark. You got it, Christian? Got it? Okay. Pull up the unique taste of Ryan. Got it? Got it? Okay, pull up the unique taste of Aubrey. Got it? Okay, you confused between the three? No. They're clear. Right? Now, that unique taste is another way of saying there's unique quality of intimacy, meaning if you and I sit facing each other and we're in silence, there's going to be a particular quality of that silence. If Aubrey and Lady Vi sit and they're in silence, there'll be a different quality of that silence. If Aubrey, right, and, Ryan sit in silence, there's going to be a different quality to that silence.
Ryan abhors silence. He starts making jokes.
You're right, right? So it's hard to sit in silence. We're going to have to do a dialogue on silence. Silence is a big topic. Silence is a big topic. Not easy to be silent, right? But so in other words, there's a unique quality to that silence, right? Because that silence is not just true self. That silence, there's, right? In other words, everyone has a unique quality of intimacy. That's a person is, as it were, reality or God's unique intimacy. So let's up-level our equation. True self plus unique perspective plus unique quality of intimacy equals unique self. Okay, now we got an equation, but now let's go back. So Eastern Enlightenment confuses between separateness and says, oh, separateness, source of all suffering, right? Must be true self. Okay, that's great, but that's not the end of the story, because your true self has a unique perspective and has a unique quality of intimacy. Now, here's the deal. Western Enlightenment made the same mistake, though. Equal opportunity employers here. Western Enlightenment also confused between separateness and uniqueness. And Western Enlightenment said, oh, the source of all dignity is separate self. Not true. The source of all dignity is unique self, right? In other words, your unique charisma, your unique quality of intimacy, your unique perspective, which gives you unique value, irreducible value, that's your unique self. Your unique self doesn't need to be your separate self. Your unique self is the unique expression of true self. I'm a unique expression of the field. And I just noticed what just happened here because it's actually shocking. And I called Ken in kind of ecstasy when this kind of clarified to me in the middle of the night. All of a sudden, we've taken the two major lines of development, right, in the history of human thought, right? One is the development, which leads all the way to the Western world, to the Renaissance, which says the apex is separate self. And the other is the development of all the mystical traditions, East and West, by the way. We call it Eastern Enlightenment, but it's really East and West. You have versions of this every place. But it says the apex of development is true self. So rational self is separate self, says Western Enlightenment, right? Mystical traditions say, no, it's true self. So we got separate self against true self, double bind, right? Deep in your heart, soul. No, actually, both of those conflated separateness and uniqueness and made a fundamental mistake. So if you disambiguate separateness and uniqueness, you realize, oh, the source of dignity in the East doesn't need to be true self. It's actually unique self, and unique self is true self plus, right? I'm one with the field, and I'm a unique expression of the field. So unique self, right, is beautiful. And then in the West, I don't need to have the source of my dignity, right, be separate self. No, I can actually transcend my separate self, like the interior scientist said, but I transcend my separate self, but not just to my true self, but into my unique self. Now, let's just go back to our puzzle piece for a second, okay? So back to puzzle piece, drum roll for puzzle piece. Do we have a drum roll, drum roll, drum roll? Hold on. Drum roll, thank you. Puzzle piece. So puzzle piece is the experience that there's just one puzzle. It's just one. That's all there is. That's true self, just one puzzle piece. Oh, Aubrey, you see lines separating the pieces? That's an illusion, right? Daishon, sit on the cushion, meditate more, right? Oh, but you have the sense that you want to individuate? That's a lack of attainment, right? You want to actually say that you're actually not just part of the one? That's your ego, right? In other words, all the systems that basically say, you were talking about a friend of yours who says, right, it's only true self, right? And you were trying to explain unique self, but he was locked in this true self paradigm. And by the way, most of Western teaching either hypothesizes, right, makes the ultimate separate self, and the classical teaching, both of the religions, the public teachings of the religions, and of kind of being a secular U.S. citizen or European citizen or Chinese citizen, right? I'm a separate self, or hypothesizes true self, right? Neither of which is right. Both of those actually cause a pathology because that's a denial of who I am. Actually, I'm unique self. Unique self is a puzzle piece which completes the puzzle. So let's go back to our puzzle piece image. All of a sudden, I'm a puzzle piece. All of a sudden, my idiosyncrasy is my uniqueness. It's my irreducible singularity, right? It's the intention of cosmos, right, which we'll talk about a little later, to manifest this uniqueness, which is me, right? And I can actually embrace my uniqueness, right? I celebrate my uniqueness because it's actually the intention of cosmos. My uniqueness is not just unconscious, I'm consciously unique. And actually at the higher levels of development and developmental theory, actually unique self comes online. when my friend Don Beck, who did Spiral Dynamics, a student of Claire Graves, read Unique Self, he called me and he says, "This is the Bible for second tier." Right? You know, in human development, when you jump to second tier, he says Unique Self is, he says, in all the developmental lines, Don said, that I've studied, right? It's at second tier. When you jump to second tier to the higher levels of development, you begin to orient based on your unique self.
Yeah, this is, you know,
Wow.
I just recently did a podcast with John Churchill, and he's deep in kind of Eastern mysticism, which he describes transcending this idea of one taste.
Right.
But I think the fixation on it is that we're not actually at a level of development that we've actually experienced ourselves as part of the whole. We're still trying to overcome the pathologizing of the separate self as the only. And so as a pointing out instruction, everybody's saying, become nobody, become I am loving awareness. And so much love to Ram Dass. He's helped my life in so many ways through his teachings, right? But I am loving awareness. Loving awareness is one thing. That is cosmos. That is the divine. And all perspective, all awareness is just participating in the one capital P perspective or one capital W witness. And when I'm doing that, then I've reached the ultimate, ultimate thing. And becoming nobody is being only loving awareness. Whereas the next second turning, the next turning, even in the mystical Eastern thought, is the next turning is great. You got that. Congratulations. Now you are loving awareness as Ram Dass, or loving awareness as Aubrey.
And Eastern thought, there are moments in Eastern thought where you can find that, but it's not where Eastern or mystical thought goes, for sure.
Yep.
Right? Which is why, you know, when I sat, you know, Ram Dass and I, we had a moment where we became very close friends. We kind of fell in love with each other. We had a wonderful time. And I you know, I just completely love the guy. You know, I went in 2005 to, and this is a Unique Self story, and we had this conversation about Unique Self, which is kind of a wild, and I think I even have a recording of the conversation I had with him about Unique Self, which I never actually thought of finding. I should send it to him. Maybe we can even put it as an appendage to this dialogue. And so I went to Maui. He was living in Maui, and it was me and Ram Dass, who's of course Richard Alpert, his original name, and Krishna Das. I love KD. I don't remember what KD's original name was, but it's not Krishna Das, that's for sure. And I'm also friends with this great guy named Surya Das. These are the Das brothers, who all have original Jewish names, of course. Right? A separate issue. We won't go down that road now. So it's KD, me, and Ram Dass. Ram Dass and I were teaching the seminar together. You know, he was in post-stroke mode, so he wasn't doing that much teaching. And we had an incredible 8 days, you know, including, you know, they had Aubrey, this insanely healthy food. It was just terrible. I was like crazy starving. I'm doing all the teaching. Ram Dass is kind of wheeling around grandly in his wheelchair. I'm doing all the teaching, and he's like eating all this lettuce and feeling fine. I'm saying, like, this is terrible. So I waited till everyone went to sleep, and I went to the refrigerator just looking for food. And thank God I found they had some at least snacks, so they had brownies. And so, you know, I just munched down like 3 brownies, and I went back to my room. About 15 minutes later, my mind and head is spinning insanely. Like, I'm like, and I have no traveling history. It wasn't my path, right? And so I figure I'm having a heart attack because I had no explanation right up.
Oh, you got dosed.
Oh my God, right? Like 3 of them. So for like 6 hours, right? Just complete, right? And like I stumble into the living room at like 6 a.m. And right at that time, Ram Dass kind of wheels himself in. And I said, oh my God, what happened? He looks at me and says, what'd you do? I said, I went to the refrigerator. He said, oh no. He said, how many? And I said, 3. And he said, no. Right? Right. And you know, I survived. And it's actually very funny. I was having dinner in Fairfax at our table, and Jade Jayutal, right, was at dinner, who's a great chanter. And he tells me this story, not knowing it's me, that Ram Dass is telling about when he first met his rabbi friend and what happened with these brownies. So it's now became an epic story. And he's a beautiful man. And, you know, so we sat, and I sat with him in LA, and I believe I have a recording of this, and I shared with him the Unique Self teaching. And he said to me afterwards, and it was just his beauty, he said, had I known this, it would have changed my whole life. Because essentially, he said, I lived in a double bind. On the one hand, I had this enormous sense of ego. And I'm going to quote him directly, said, I wanted to walk in the halls of power. My father was a powerful man. I went to Harvard, and everyone thinks I was excited about getting expelled from Harvard along with Timothy Leary. Well, I was and I wasn't, right? I wanted to be at Harvard. I wanted to be, I went east, and, I met Neem Karoli Baba and, that whole, beautiful story, and that's when, KD and him met, and KD also became just a wonderful friend, and he's a beautiful, beautiful man. But it's enormously confusing. It was confusing for Ram Dass, he said. And what I thought was this desire to walk in halls of power and to impact and change history, right? He said, which I wanted to do all the time, and I still want to do, right? I had to actually ascribe to ego. Right? That clearly was a mistake, right? Because that's my ego talking, because everything Neem Karoli Baba told me was about disappearing, right? And I said to him, I said, well, let me ask you a question. And as we started this conversation, I said, did Neem Karoli Baba disappear? I mean, the way you describe him, he sounds like pretty distinct, utterly unique figure, one of a kind, irreducible, and yet you're telling me that he's talking about disappearing. Do you think there's anything wrong with the story? Right? In other words, no, there's something else happening here. And I began to unpack unique self, not as ego, not as your talents, not as your Myers-Briggs test, but unique self as the irreducibly unique expression of true self. Right? In other words, the field generated Neem Karoli Baba, who is your unique self. Who are you? You're an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence and the love beauty and the love desire of all that is, that lives in you, as you, and through you, and that never was, is, or will be ever again. And as such, you have an irreducibly unique perspective, an irreducibly unique quality of intimacy that allows you to give your unique gift to your unique field, right, in your unique field of intimacy and influence, and that is your unique responsibility and your unique obligation, right? And oh, that's Neem Karoli Baba. Of course, he said, of course that's Neem Karoli Baba. Neem Karoli Baba didn't efface personality. He was actually intensely personal. Let's play for a second, and this is where, for Ram Dass, it was a gorgeous moment for him. So I said, let's look at that again. There's pre-personal self, then you get personal self, separate self, false self. And then the traditions talk about, and that's the language that Ram Dass used because he absorbed it from the traditions, right? The Eastern traditions. They talk about now you're going to the impersonal. We've all heard that, right? Move beyond your story, go to the impersonal. Okay, so that's true self. But then after the impersonal, you come back to the higher level personal. In other words, there's personal level 1, separate self, the impersonal true self, but then beyond the impersonal, the personal comes back online, an intensification of the personal, which is not the personal of your fragmented, broken, traumatized, right, ego story. It's your unique self story. And actually, Ram Dass, your desire to walk in the halls of power, part of it might be early pathology, but part of it was this realization that you've got a gift to give, and that your unique circle of intimacy and influence might be the halls of power. And then actually, you wrote a book called Be Here Now, and that landed you as an icon in culture, which you never quite expected as you made those funny diagrams and sent it to the artist and put out this weird book that you thought a few people would buy, and all of a sudden it exploded in culture, and you felt like, oh my God, I want to give this gift. That wasn't your ego talking. That was actually reality having a Richard Alpert experience and renaming him Ram Dass and wanting to speak through you to culture. And he said, my whole life I was ripped apart because I didn't know how to resolve internally, double bind that enormous sense of self and this teaching that I should be no self. So the way we resolve that is unique self. It's unique self brings together separate self and true self in a full synergistic embrace into emergent. Wow.
Was there a spark of unique self when the Hellenistic cultures talked about the daemon?
The daemon, beautiful.
Because the daemon seems to be like there is some unique thing that you're driven towards that's yours and only yours, and your daemon is yours.
Yes, your daemon. Your daemon. I love that you talk about daemon. And, it's funny, right? When I wrote an essay called The Evolutionary Emergence of Unique Self before the Unique Self book came out, and actually an academic journal called the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice devoted an entire issue, it's a peer-reviewed academic journal, to unique self theory as kind of, Ken called it the best, theory of self we have, and actually adopted it as a chapter in his own integral theory, and it was the only chapter that And it's why he wanted to have conversations with people. It's the beauty of Ken. He said, okay, what am I missing? So it became a kind of a key chapter. And so Ken and I were talking on the phone, and I was thinking about how to name the article. And we're going to name it The Evolutionary Emergent of Unique Self. And Ken and I, were just laughing about it because it is an evolutionary emergent. It's undeniably new. And yet, as Aubrey asks, on the other hand, whenever something's undeniably new, evolution's not linear. That's a major mistake. And theorists, this notion of a linear evolution is bullshit. Evolution, Michael Murphy, my friend says evolution meanders, right? It zigzags. David Graeber, the anthropologist we talked about, points out that, there's moments where something emerges, it has a moment, then it kind of disappears, and then it kind of resurfaces. So there are, as you're pointing to intuitively, and I think, wisely, there are fragrances of unique self that appear, right, in different places, both in psychology and physics and in ancient traditions. And the daemon that you point to actually talk about in the Unique Self book. I think you're absolutely right. The daemon is this sense that there's something speaking through me, that the field, right, is calling me. There's a sense of calling, the sense of being called. Your daemon calls you, and your daemon, right, is this larger entelechy. It's this larger sense that the field wants something from you, wants to speak through you, right? It's what I call reality having an Aubrey experience, right? But that's your daemon, right? And as the reality is moving through you, I'm not just living, I'm lived, right? Right? And when you actually realize that your daemon is an incarnation, a unique incarnation of the eros of cosmos. Daemon is one of the faces of eros. Then you're actually lived as love. But you're not lived as love just as the field of love, right? Which is actually kind of insipid, which has got no fuck.
Yeah.
Right? It's got no eros, right? You're lived as a unique expression of love. Aubrey is an irreducible, unique expression of love. And whenever Aubrey tries to turn away from his unique self, from his calling, the daemon, right, steps in. And the daemon, right, the daemon's not a person. The daemon is the intelligence of the field itself, which is moving through you and calling you and playing with you. So that's the daemon. The daemon is very, very important. That's a proto, I would call that a proto expression of unique self. I'll give you a second example. In Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism, they have what's called the 10 ox-herding pictures. And the 10 ox-herding pictures are pictures of enlightenment. And the 10th ox-herding picture is after true self, when the sage turns back to the marketplace, right? And this turning back to the marketplace is actually an expression of, okay, now I'm going to uniquely enter and engage reality and seek to transform it. So there are moments, right, of unique self that exist. And actually Nietzsche, right, who goes to kind of to take it all down and says, yet the one thing we know, Nietzsche says, and thus spake Zarathustra, is that there's this ineluctable and irreducible, and I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, you, that's unlike any other. Oscar Wilde, you might as well be yourself because everyone else is taken, right? And there's this sense that's kind of undeniable, right? That what we know anthropologically is we know actually that my unique self matters, and that's not my ego talking. And I just to feel the relief in that. I mean, Aubrey-ness. Is Aubrey-ness a function of, Aubrey grew up with this place and that time and this, that, and this, that. And, by the way, I haven't met your family. I'm looking forward to meet your mom tomorrow night. Yay, which is crazy exciting. And so Aubrey's going to do what he's doing because somewhere along the way he got traumatized and therefore he needed to do a public thing. And isn't that a shame? And if he only would have worked that out therapeutically, he might have been a successful accountant. But now he's got to do it right, right. But there's this little voice that says, right, well, if I'm shining in the world, am I compensating? Shining is basically viewed as a compensation, right? And we're lost in our kind of grandiosity. But actually, it's not grandiosity; it's grandeur. Human beings have grandeur. And actually, what Aubrey's trying to do is, and we all deal with egoic structures and issues, but at core, you feel the call of unique self, right? And we get to be friends, we get to love each other when we realize that we each have unique selves, right? And so all of a sudden, jealousy disappears, because jealousy means I want to hijack some of your separate self. The second I'm a unique self, I love you. I can be in devotion to your unique self. I can be ecstatic about your unique self because I'm in my unique self. So the only real meeting of love is between unique selves. True selves can't love each other because they're just true selves. There's no uniqueness.
Well, there's no subject-object separation.
There's no
either.
subject-object separation, so there's no relationship, so there's no love. True selves can't love each other. Separate selves always have to be in what Hobbes called a state of war. So, right, that's what Hobbes described. And John Locke, who's the best theorist of Western thought, is really, Hobbes in a velvet glove, but it's the same, it's Leo Strauss's phrase, right? Locke is Hobbes in a velvet glove. The same basic notion, which is where, this notion of rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, the success story, came from. And Max Weber called it the Protestant work ethic. There's a lot of names for it, but it's all basically rivalrous conflict, win-lose metrics. And as long as we're ultimately in a win-lose metrics, we can't be intimate with each other. We can't have shared identity. We can't really love each other. It's all ultimately, if Foucault told us, right, wrongly, but it's a power game. It's all a set of exchanges. It's all, exchanged commodities, right? Heidegger writes, kind of stuck in the same paradigm, you can never overcome loneliness. And it's always separation, right? It's tragic. It's only unique selves that can create we space, right? Unique self is when two unique selves come together who both have a unique contribution, right? They have, as Walt Whitman said, right, in all of the din and hullabaloo of reality, right, you've got a verse to contribute, right? You've got a verse to contribute. And your verse is not mine, right? And imagine if we put our two verses together, what that could be.
A podcast.
A podcast, right? Here we go, right?
Here we are.
And it's a let there be a podcast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's wild, right? Luria, right, the lineage master of Hebrew wisdom, right, talks about every person having a fundamental responsibility to write their unique letter in the cosmic scroll. And that every human being actually is a unique letter in the cosmic scroll. So now we begin to have the sense of unique self. Drum roll, it's not the end.
And there's, as a lead-in to this next level of where you're going, is, and to tie in a few things, there's sometimes an idea that your unique self has a unique gift that is still somewhat blind to what the entire cosmos, the field itself, wants and wants to draw forth from you. And
Right.
this is a discussion I've had with our dear
important.
brother Eric Godzi, and he has this very kind of he had at least a stricter idea about the daemon, and it's like, my daemon is here to do this, and I would say, and people would ask me, well, what are you going to do next? And I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do next, because I have to listen to the evolving nature of the field and find what the field wants from me before I know what I'm going to do. Yeah, I have some ideas. I think I'm going to write some books. I think I'm going to do some things. But if the world degrades incredibly fast and one of these existential threats hit, I may be in a far different role as warrior or as, caretaker or as a farmer. I don't fucking know. There may be a whole variety of different things that I may put my unique gifts into, dependent upon the field. And what this is leading to is what I believe you're going to is the unique self symphony. And
Yes.
it's really listening to the field as your unique self and then allowing the gifts of your unique self to respond to a genuine need from the field.
That's beautiful. And that is Unique Self Symphony, right? And we'll get to it. There's in between Unique Self and Unique Self Symphony, there's one more step we want to go, which will speak to a lot of what you just said. But just before we get to it, to the next level, because we have so far, let's just see where we are.
5.
We've got pre-personal self. We've got number 1. Number 2, separate self. Number 3, false self. Number 4, true self. Number 5, unique self. That's where we are. Now, we're going to go to 2 more, and this is where it gets crazy exciting. Up till now, we've just been playing. Now it gets like insane in the most beautiful way. But we're going to get to evolutionary unique self and unique self symphony. The next 2, the last 2. But let's just, before we get there, you gave us a kind of a precursor foreshadowing, and you point out that you've got to be in relationship to the field, and so the field is true self. But let me add something to true self. And I had a wonderful exchange with our friend Daniel about a year ago, a big Vox exchange, which is often how we talk, on true self. And what I was sharing with Daniel is that true self is not just the field of consciousness, okay? True self is the field of consciousness and desire. It's, right? Consciousness is just awareness. But awareness never exists without desire. This is a very, very big deal. right? So in, let's say, Kashmir Shaivism, which is the source tradition of Buddhism, they talk about Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is being, Chit is consciousness. So the inside of being is consciousness, and then the inside of Chit is Ananda, which is love, bliss, or desire. So the inside of the inside, Sat, Chit, Ananda, being consciousness, desire, the inside of the inside is desire. Okay, wow, right? And so the field, right, is not just the field of being, of consciousness, but that's an defacing of the field. So when Buddha talks about, or Buddhism talks about one taste, true but partial, my brothers and sisters, but it's two tastes. It's being and becoming, or it's stillness and desire, right? Stillness, spacious, stillness, psychedelic journey, certain ways Aubrey might stack to bring you to kind of this field of spacious stillness. And then there's becoming turbulent, ecstatic, pulsing, urgent desire. And I remember having a conversation with a dear friend, Jerry Judd, who started a wonderful, not Jewish actually, but it was called Shalom Mountain. Jerry died at about 100 and was one of the great pioneers of the 20th century. And I was talking to Jerry about urgency, and he was a true self devotee, and he just got angry at me. It was about 96, so I, cut some slack. He said, urgency, there's no urgency, that's separate self. I said, no, there is urgency. There is a kind of ecstatic urgency, and ecstatic urgency is the quality of unique self. The field is alive in me, and I'm listening to the field. So when I'm a unique self, I'm an expression of true self, and true self is the field, and it's the field of intimate communion. It's the field of desire. It's the field of emergence, and that tells me two things about my unique self. One, my unique self is not a reified, unchanging eternity. It's an evolving eternity. It's an evolving quality of eternity. So I have an evolving unique self, A, your first point, right? And your second point, both of them critical, right, is that you've got to be in constant permeability with the field. The field is pouring into you and you're pouring into the field. And there's this constant movement between you and the field, and you're listening to the field and the field's listening to you. And there's this interpenetration that's always happening. And that field is the field of desire, right? So to be in true self means I'm participating in the field of desire. That's a big deal, the field of consciousness and desire, right? The only time desire gets to be problematic is if you think that you have local desire. There are no local desires, right? All local desire is in the larger field of desire, and desire has integrity if it honors the field.
Well, yeah, you could have localized false self, pseudo.
That's right, and you can have unique desire.
Yeah,
you can have unique. You have utterly unique. You have both. You have both authentic, unique desire, and you can have kind of false self-surface desire. But desire itself is beautiful. Desire is the nature of reality. Reality is desire. Who are you? You are desire. And who is Aubrey? Aubrey is desire. That's who Aubrey is. That's true self. But he's a unique expression of desire, unique self.
We're actually making little lies every time we call anybody a noun. Actually,
Right.
There's a little embedded lie. And I think there's a very cool term, and I think it's actually in one of your unpublished works of phenomenology that you actually go into it. And it's the term for actually taking something which is an evolutionary
The
process.
denominalization of self.
I thought it was that, but
Yeah,
I didn't want
denominalization
to
of
fuck
self.
it
Yeah,
up.
it's beautiful, right?
And Stan Groff actually on our podcast was telling me that. He just looked at me and he speaks slow and direct, and he's got the wisdom of all of his years accumulated.
The beautiful
and he
man.
says, "You are not Aubrey, you are Aubreying."
You are Aubreying.
And this table is not a table, this table is tabling. Because 1,000 years from now, this table will not be even when it's not life. It's part of the evolutionary process. It's a first principle, first value.
And so people don't get lost, right? And so the table, right, is going to transmute, right, without an obvious sense of will. Aubreyness, just so we can distinguish between those two, Aubreyness is a distinct consciousness. That consciousness is embedded in a body. That body is part of the consciousness, and we'll have to come back to this before we finish today. And although Aubrey is not a unique self in a meat sack, because actually his bodiness, his embodiment is ineradicably not separate and embedded in and inextricably inter-included, right, in his self, in his unique self. Nonetheless, right? His unique self is not dependent on his body.
Mm.
So if God forbid we cut off Mark's arm or Aubrey's arm, but let's say Mark's, I don't want to be cutting off your arm or mine, but you cut off your arm, right? You're still you, right? You cut off your leg, you're still you, right? You still have your unique self. And ultimately, we have
What
an enormous.
I kind of feel like I push back a little that is a significant evolution of your unique self, actually,
You lose something of your uniqueness
and
when you cut
potentially
off your
gain it,
arm,
and
and you
potentially gain it.
potentially gain another part, right? And so,
One example of this, for example, people go through, and right now it's a crazy. We're in a crazy time, a medical time.
mhm,
So fecal transplants are showing some of the most promising psychological, psychiatric benefit. So if you actually change your gut flora with someone who
right,
has healthy neurochemistry, because everybody has heard the term that the gut is the second brain. Well,
right.
fecal transplant actually puts new microbiome in your gut. You're producing new neurotransmitters. Massive shifts in personality start to happen when they've done this in mice that had a tendency for obesity. You switch the fecal biome, and then with a mouse that's super athletic and loves running on the wheel, then the actual personality of that mouse changes and
Right.
evolves.
So
And
this
so,
this is a big deal. So let's stop for a second. So let's just see where we are. And I apologize. It's an insincere apology, but for a second, let me just locate where we are, because I want to. Let's go into this for a second without losing our thread, which is,
yeah.
so we're up to unique self. We're taking a little commercial break to talk about, in this level of unique self, what's the relationship between the mind and the body,
Hmm.
because that's where we haven't gotten to evolutionary unique self, and we haven't gotten to unique self symphony. And so you point out, and you made this point in the beginning, right,
Hmm.
which is a beautiful point, and we'll play with this for a second to see if we can clarify it. Is that, the dualistic idea, right, which reigns, in the 16th and 17th century, which that there's a mind and a body, and they're actually two utterly distinct worlds. And by the way, 17th century dualism became 19th century materialism,
Hmm.
right? Because basically they made a circle. Let's say, like, draw a circle, cut the circle in half. On top, you've got spirit, the word they use, and the bottom, you have matter, right? And so those are two completely separate worlds. Spirit actually steps in and directly runs the world of matter, but they're two complete, utterly separate worlds, right? Now, the entire movement of science went against that, and science began to realize that those worlds are not separate worlds, and there was less and less ways to measure spirit in the ways that science was doing quantitative measurement. So by the time we got to the 19th century, people looked at that circle and said, let's just lop off the top, right?
Hmm.
So 17th century dualism became 19th century materialism. Now, you're pointing to, right, something which is absolutely true. I call what you're pointing to pan-interiority. And pan-interiority is this realization. There's lots of different names to it, and lots of different shades of it. Some people talk about panpsychism, right? Whitehead talked about pan-experientialism. I won't bore everyone in this point to kind of talk about the distinctions and why we coined, a new term, Zach Stein, pan-interiority. But pan-interiority basically means that you can't split in the manifest world between the depth of self-reflective mind and the body. That the body's actually, as you say, not a meat sack. The body's intelligent,
Hmm.
it's living, it's alive, and there's actually an inextricable union between exterior and interior. You can't actually split them. It's not that there's spirit, right, and matter. No, actually, everything is both interior and exterior, and they affect each other, which begins to introduce parapsychology,
Hmm.
begins to introduce, continuity of consciousness, begins to, to explain, right, all of the phenomena we have of, telepathy,
Hmm.
all of the phenomena we have, which are poltergeists, all the phenomena we have of, out of body experiences, all of the phenomena we have of, mediums, right? In other words, that whole realm of parapsychology, which is an empirical realm. And anyone who doesn't think it's an empirical realm is just an idiot, right? I apologize, right? It's just stupidity, right? Now, there's so much information, and William James at Harvard, and Henry Sedgwick, right, with his wife Edith at, Cambridge, started the British and then the American Psychical Society. There's 130 years of probably the most rigorous research done, which establishes the empirical validity of parapsychology, right? Which is based on this notion that actually, right, the body, heart, mind are kind of an entire oneness. They're part of a larger union. They affect each other. They move together. It's why in psychoneuroimmunology, right, we proved what our grandmothers knew, psychoneuroimmunology, that, between the hypothalamus and the frontal cortex, right, the amygdala, right, there's very, very clear correlative relationships. They affect each other, meaning, right, my attitude, right, affects my physical performance. My grief, right, makes me sick, right? My partner dies, who I've been with for 40 years. I don't feel I have a purpose in life, right? Within 6 months, right, I die,
Yeah.
right? In other words, there's very clear relationships, and yet that entire body of work also tells us that the abriness, right, the quality of abriness transcends, has a continuity of consciousness. So that body, which obviously I've trained, right, to be clear about that, right? We always give Anna, the credit, but that's okay,
I
right?
saw you doing those kettlebell swings.
Totally.
It was impressive.
It's actually weird. Sometimes when I take off my shirt, people say, you don't see my head, is that Aubrey? It just happens all the time.
I would
Weird?
expect Kyle.
Kyle,
Kingsbury.
right?
Yeah.
No, Kyle. No one ever says Kyle. Right. Hot damn. Kyle.
Your hyperbole only goes so far?
It only goes so far.
Okay,
Like,
fair
it's
enough.
only-
I didn't know that there was bounds. I thought we were playing a game of extremes.
It's a fair point. Okay, Kyle, I'm in. Okay, I'm in. Right, but so in other words, so abriness, there's a continuity of consciousness. We have an enormous amount of empirical evidence for the continuity of consciousness of abriness, and even Buddhism, right, that kind of says, I don't know, right, I'm one with the field of consciousness, slips in unique self, kind of surreptitiously, without telling you it does, by calling it reincarnation.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, and this is and again to counter the very thing that I previously described, my dear brother, Parker Sherry. Parker Sherry. And I have in my own practices, again, as my own experiential psychonaut, have what I believe to be is the ability to actually communicate with Parker. I've had conversations with Parker which have been wildly beautiful and rich and surprising. And it's surprising when it makes you laugh.
Yeah.
Like when you hear something from them, laughter comes from something that you haven't thought through and you wouldn't expect.
Right.
And in these kind of conversations, in the medicine, in this state, and I'll find myself chuckling because he was saying something that only Parker could say. And it feels, and again, people could say that's just my memory playing out in a program. Okay, whatever. I can't prove that it's not, but I feel in my body and in my consciousness that I'm having that communication with Parker, who recently passed. And so there is this continuity that extends beyond the body.
So that is right. So that's correct. In other words, there is a continuity of consciousness that's real. So on the one hand, I'm one with the body, right? And the body's not just a temple for the soul, right? And so that's what you were trying to point towards in the beginning. And the way that the lineage talks about it, at least one lineage, says that we talk about light and vessels, and that we used to think that the body was the vessel for the soul, which is the light, right? And one thinker, Shneur Zalman of La'adi, not something I would name your kid, by the way, right? Points out that Gavoa Shorash HaKelim Mishor She'orot, and this is a complex interior science statement, but it means higher is the source of the vessels than the source of the light, meaning the body, which is the vessel, is not just the light, is actually higher than the source of the light, meaning the body is fully intelligent and alive, and that as long as we're in this manifest world, there's no Cartesian dualism, right? The body, right, and heart, or the interior and exterior, are one fully organismic expression of livingness, and there's a continuity of consciousness beyond this body. So sorry to say, you're gonna have to start training again next time, right? And and you might be a woman, right? Which would be beautiful.
What's an interesting, and
I
this
think
is
you'd be a hot woman, by the way.
I could be.
You could be.
Depends.
Okay.
So one of the things that I'm curious about is, and I don't know this from my understanding of the cosmos, but I'm curious as to whether evolution, because we're leading towards the evolution of unique self. I'm curious as to whether evolution actually can happen in the discarnate expression of the continuity of consciousness, or whether actually reincarnation is
Right.
necessary
I love
for evolution.
I love you, Aubrey. I love when we're trying to get to fucking evolutionary unique self, and you throw in like another huge topic, right? Just as like just kind of So that's a great question. In other words, and it's actually a beautiful inquiry. But let me go back one step and then forward one step, because you said about, and I landed to do this dialogue for us to spend this week in deep study and practice. I landed actually the night that your friend Parker Sherry passed.
Yeah.
And so he's obviously been with us this week, and I didn't have the privilege to know him, but you and I got to sit on the couch and talk about him, and to hear your stories about him, which is the practice when a person passes, is to tell stories, in the most beautiful way, and to invoke them, which you have. And as you were describing, your conversation with Parker Sherry, you said, and people could say it's just my memory reflex and I can't prove it, although you can't prove it in ways that are obviously measurable. First off, in your own anthro-ontology, my own humanness ontology, the realness that I directly access through my interior, you actually have a sense of its absolute realness, number one, which is critical in terms of validating it. But number two, and we're not going to go down this road now, and it's definitely a separate dialogue, but we actually at this point have empirical information which indicates to us that in any form of rational thought, right, the only way we can explain an enormous amount of empirical information, which cannot be explained in any other way than the continuity of consciousness after this life. So in terms of what we call proof, we have better quote-unquote proof, right, for the continuity of consciousness than we do for most scientific theorems that build science. That's a very, very big deal to realize, and that was not true 150 years ago. So this is part of the evolution of consciousness, and we've gathered information in a new way. We've collated that information. Just to give you one example, Ian Stevens at the University of Virginia and Michael Murphy funded it, collected about 2,600 cases of reincarnation, which he then documented, and then he investigated very, very carefully, right, X amount of them, right? And the only valid hypothesis for a kid living in place X, who's born, 10 months after a kid in place Y, who's, massive amounts of miles away, no cultural, exchange between them. And Stevens researchers checked very, very carefully for any possibility of deception at a level which most scientific experiments, none, actually even vaguely approach. And this kid in place Y knows everything about place X, remembers all of these memories from place X, has a mark, let's say where an arrow went through, kid one, has a mark, in his body at the exact same place with a full set of memories that are fully available to him, that live in him, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just a quick, snapshot. And the only plausible, rational explanation is that there's a continuity of consciousness. And that's just one of about 6 different pieces of valid research. So for someone to dismiss continuity of consciousness today, right, that's not actually a valid position for a rational person. And, Michael Murphy, who again is the president of Esalen, and Michael and I had a number of years of just beautiful conversation, and he used to come to our board meetings. And we held them in Mill Valley, where he lived, of the think tank. And Michael got up and he said, I used to say I was an agnostic about reincarnation, and Michael is very scientifically based. And at a certain point, I began to feel sleazy. I actually felt like I was a sleazy person because I'm not an agnostic. All the rational information is one way, and I didn't want to say it because I didn't want to be dismissed as woo-woo, right? So I realized I was actually lying. I was actually completely out of integrity. So we actually have an enormous amount of evidence for continuity of consciousness, and there's no rational being that can easily dismiss that, right? It actually is the best explanation we have of an enormous amount of empirical evidence. That's just a bracket. Bracket and bracket.
Let me, dangerously, I'm going to lob another bracket without trying to derail us too
We
much,
haven't even gotten to your
too
first
much
law,
further,
by the way.
Yes, there's another bracket that's imminent and waiting.
Bracket within a bracket.
A bracket within a bracket.
Hot damn.
What is the cultural, just really quickly, what do you think is the cultural pressure to actually not believe in the continuity of consciousness? Why do we desire collectively? What is the collective zeitgeist desire to claim that there is no continuity of consciousness? Why are we trying to do this?
It comes actually from a sacred place, right? In other words, the religions hijacked heaven, right? And the religions used heaven right, to create control, right? And the road to heaven was lined with obedience to a particular set of dictates, right, from a particular religion that actually claimed that only its adherents got into heaven,
Yeah.
right? And immortality was essentially used to avoid, right, the metaphysical and spiritual and moral obligation, right, to actually transform this world. So Christianity, remember Crosby, Still, Nash, and Young, before our time, but whatever, you know, was something like, how many people died in the name of Christ? I can't believe it all, right? In other words, so people get massacred both by Buddhist sects massacring each other and Christian sects massacring each other and Sunnis and Shiites massacring each other, but they're doing it, for the sake of the integrity of their religion, right? And for the sake of ensuring, right, that, let's say, the Christian, right, Inquisition, that the people that they're murdering will get to heaven, right? They'll have immortality of the soul. So in other words, or the obligation to actually treat, right, profound suffering, right? The notion that that person's now going to go to the next world, right, actually somehow frees us of our obligation to create heaven on earth. So there was actually an impulse in modernity, which was a holy impulse, which was, let's fucking create heaven on earth. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful impulse, and heaven, or was caricatured as harps playing, and it's probably not harps, it's probably violins. So I get they got that wrong. But heaven was a caricature, right? And it became an exit, right? From this world. And we actually, in order to act just like in a marriage, I always, whenever I'm working with a couple, I always say you got to close the exits. Once you got a lot of exits, once you got a lot of exits, right? So in order to actually stay and work this world, there was a sense that modernity had that you got to close the exits, and it wasn't wrong, right? However, when you close the exits in a way in which you basically then say, and the nature of this world is purely materialist, and it's actually over when it's over, you actually create despair, right? Because it's actually a violation, A, of what we know, as we just pointed out empirically. I also know it anthropologically, and it's completely fucked up morally, right? Because it's completely clear that fairness does not happen at this moment in time for most human beings in this lifetime. You cannot actually understand and deal, right, with the suffering in the world, right, if you limit, right, reality to the space of one lifetime. It's just, you can't, right? So if you know in your body that reality is holding a dimension of fairness, you also have what I would call an anthro-ontological portal into the reality of the continuity of consciousness. So that's a different portal. In other words, we've described now two different portals. One portal into the continuity of consciousness is empirical information that validates it. One. A second portal is, right, there's actually 12 doors, which we're not going to talk about now. There's 12 anthro-ontological doors where you can get a direct first-person knowing of the continuity of consciousness. And one of them is the experience of fairness, that fairness is a core structure of reality, and then the realization that fairness never happens, right, for most human beings within one lifetime. So your moral sense tells you, right, that it can't be over when it's over. That's actually fascinating. So there's 12 anthro-ontological doors. There's also, third, a philosophical door, which is pan-interiority, right, which is philosophically, which we're not going to work out now, the best understanding of the human being is continuity of consciousness. So there's three different doors, which is not our topic. Right.
Well,
that was your fault.
And I think maybe totally. And there's another topic that we still can, or maybe we can just ignore
no,
the
let's
bracket.
pick it up for a second as you put it out.
But ultimately, what this is speaking to is not only the who are you question, but it's also kind of leaving breadcrumbs to where are you.
It's total breadcrumbs.
Starting to understand this second.
To where are you.
And these questions, of course, you actually have to bleed them into each other.
They have to bleed into each other. And let's bracket and just I want to honor the other lob that you did, lob which is the opposite of lobotomy. Lob means let's think about that, which you said, is evolution only in incarnate form or in the worlds between worlds, which are described by the interior sciences? And by the way, you can get an anthro-ontological knowing to the worlds between worlds. In other words, you were 5-6 days ago, and again, I now say this with just so much gentleness and respect, because to invoke a person you didn't know and your friend, I want to do it with just enormous respect. You were just with your friend 7 days ago, Parker Sherry. Now he's not here, right? Where did he go? I was with my friend recently, a few years ago, Barbara Marx Hubbard, and she was literally we were about to do a program together, and we got on the phone. She had had an incident. She was in the hospital. I said, let me talk to her. She got on the phone. She said, Mark, with this beautiful delight. It was the last word she spoke. Right, I flew to her bedside, and she died a couple of days later. But it was so clear in my embodied sense that Barbara wasn't gone.
Yeah.
Where'd she go, to New Jersey? Right. I mean, in other words, but I had a direct realization, like you had with Parker, right, of the continuity of consciousness. And so you realize now the interior sciences have an enormous conversation, that really is too much of a divergence. We won't go there. It's a different conversation. But there's an enormous conversation about the worlds between worlds, right, and about the evolution that happens in them.
Yeah.
So let's just say that's addressed by the interior sciences, right? Clearly, we've got to be very, very careful and humble there when we move between certainty and uncertainty.
Sure.
Because we've never been there.
Yep.
And we don't have direct information. We can't claim dogmatic information. We got to hold, trembling before reality, the mystery, and yet gather the informations we have, with a kind of tender tentativeness. But there's an enormous depth in the interior sciences, on this topic that deserves address. Bracket, evolutionary unique self.
Evolutionary unique self. And just to close in my own thinking on that,
brother.
I asked a question, and
Please, brother.
If you consider that evolution is a first principle and first value, everything evolves, all is evolving, then evolution must go all the way up and all the way down.
Yes.
So evolution must occur in the worlds,
Nicely
between
done.
worlds as well.
Nicely.
And it's also one interesting thing that I got from my brother Matthias De Stefano, who remembers his past lives. And this is another way that if you want to just feel it in your body, listen to him sing Atlantean songs that he sang as a mother to his child in the civilization of Kem, and just feel what those songs evoke in you, and see if that isn't a lullaby that was sung and is sung in our ancestral memory. But what he says is that in the world between worlds, we're stepping into a place of timelessness, and this is another big bracket that I just want to share this little piece. And in that moment is both an eternity of time spent in the world between worlds, because there is no time, and also an instant reincarnation. Right. And so it is possible that actually it's our understanding of time that makes this seem contradictory when it's actually paradoxical. The paradox of an infinite amount of time between worlds and an instant reincarnation in some form as matter. And maybe matter is then therefore inextricably woven to evolution, which is always happening because eternity and instant is happening at the same time in this grand cosmic paradox. But I think the key point of this is that I believe that we would probably both agree that evolution is the first principle, value of the cosmos.
So you said three things, and of course we have this beautiful, gorgeous, beautiful risk, but it's a beautiful risk, is that we're in a deep set of conversations, and so something emerges, and it's part of this other conversation. So that was the evolution thing. But you landed it exactly correctly, right? Which is that evolution itself is an actual first principle and first value of cosmos. And what evolution means is that reality is a series of transformations.
Mm-hmm.
That's the nature of reality. Evolution equals reality is a series of transformations, and if reality is both manifest and unmanifest, it's both interiors and exteriors, right? Then there's no reason to suggest, and the interior sciences realize this, that the transformations end right at the end of the space, right, of one finite lifetime. Transformation continues. So that's one, and that's critical. That's to realize that evolution is the first principle and first value, meaning the process of transformation is a first principle and first value. And the reason that matters, friends, is that means that our own impulse towards transformation, right, is not, right, actually a violation, right? It's not that there's no place to go, right? And that Buddhist sense of just sit still, right, and be where you're trying to get, there's no place to get. Well, actually there is, my friend, right? Right? Yeah. Actually, it's not just being, it's also becoming, right? And what sometimes Buddhism does, kind of, when I say Buddhism, I mean kind of popular renditions of Buddhism, but also often structural forms of certain forms of mysticism, is basically defy evolution. In other words, it took us quite a few billion years to get to a human neocortex, right, that can actually, right, think about its own transformation, be conscious of its own evolution, and to actually cut off the frontal lobe of the human neocortex and to make a regressive move and say, I'm just going to be in a pure state of beingness is actually a huge mistake. Being and becoming are included in each other. Now, the Matthias, you invoked your friend Matthias, you spoke to me about. He's one of the people we said we have to all meet each other. We'll do that at some point and raise some glasses of wine. I don't have a memory of past lives. That's a
Me
very
neither.
beautiful gift.
Never had one. Of all the
It's a
things that
beau-
I've done and every medicine I've taken, I've never
beautiful,
had a memory of
beautiful
a past life.
gift that Matthias has. Luria, right? One of my teachers, right, had a gift of both his own past life. He had a very particular, unique gift of knowing other people's past lives. I have in work with people, I can get a sense sometimes of other people's past lives, but not a clear sense. I don't have Matthias's sense. It's a very beautiful gift that he has, which I want to just
He
beautifully honor.
describes it as like he says that if we're all different cells in the one organism, that he's and different organs have different organs. There's liver cells.
Yeah,
there's
beautiful.
Pancreas cells. He's a memory cell.
Yeah,
And
that's beautiful.
It's just one of the organs of
Yeah, it's
the
beautiful.
human cosmos.
And
that
that's
has
unique
that
self.
ability.
That's a
his unique
particular.
self.
That's a particular, and that's his unique gift.
Yep.
Right.
Totally.
And by the way, right, and to validate Matthias, right, we actually have right this expression, this memory cell appears in all traditions at all times. We've always had people like that. And again, I have a fragrance of it, in particular places, so I can feel it. But we also have enormous right empirical information that that's real. So that's an important piece of information that you can't take off the table
Yeah.
and be a rational person.
Yeah.
Right? That's critical. So now we have a drum roll. It's drum roll time. Yes. So we are at evolutionary unique self. So let's just see where we are for a second. Now, in some sense, we're at the end of our dialogue, but this is actually this is the most exciting part, which leads us into, our second dialogue where we start talking about how does this play in sexuality? How does it play in love? How does it play in joy? What's the relationship of why is unique self the only antidote to pornography? What does those two things possibly even have to do with each other? Right.
People's mind is just like, what?
Right? And they're completely
Whoa.
related. Why is your unique sexuality the only response to kind of an impersonal sexuality?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, there's so much, right, to say. And how does it change psychology? How does it change education? My friend Zach Stein, right, wrote a chapter on our unique self theory in his book, Education in a Time Between Worlds, which is enormously important, right? And we actually have people in psychology, in business, right, in education, in economics. We're actually working on unique self volumes, right, which apply unique self to all dimensions of the ecosystem of human life. So it's the change that changes everything. Charles Taylor wasn't wrong. If you get right the answer to the question of who am I, when I say get right, the best response that includes the most in an eloquent second simplicity. So everything we're talking about today is second simplicity. So, first simplicity sloganing doesn't work. You got to do all the complexity, level 2. So first level, first simplicity, level 2, complexity. And it's a core model that I've deployed for years. And then level 3 is second simplicity, where we've kind of integrated all of the complexity. And now we're able to talk in these kind of orienting generalizations that are actually accurate and allow us to make sense of reality while we stand before the mystery, right? So in that light, let's just say a couple things before we hit evolutionary unique self. Let's just take a look, and now it gets very exciting and very elegant. So pre-personal self, that's where we started. We went from pre-personal to the personal. And the personal was separate self and false self. Then we went to true self, which calls itself the impersonal. Right? That's now the impersonal. Then we said, no, but that's not the height. That's not the apex, right? As the traditions thought. Actually, above that is the personal beyond the impersonal, level 2 personal, which is unique self. Unique self, which is the discretion of infinity in a person, right? My personhood is the irreducible, unique expression of the field, right? That's unique self. And when I really get that, right, that catapults me naturally to number 6, evolutionary unique self. And evolutionary unique self, simply said, is the realized unique self, or unique self in an evolutionary context, unique self with an evolutionary relationship to life. Meaning, right, I can actually say seriously the statement, Who am I? I am evolution in person. It's a wild sentence. True self says, I am being in person.
Mm.
I'm the eternity of being in person, but in that true self said, my personhood disappears. Unique self says, no, no, no. I'm being uniquely. I'm being seeing through a unique set of eyes, right? I'm the unique set of eyes, the unique quality of intimacy, the unique perspective of true self.
Mm.
Evolutionary unique self says, I'm evolution in person, right? I am the personal face of the evolutionary impulse. The evolutionary impulse actually beats in me. And the force, the pulse, the throbbing of the entire evolutionary impulse is awake and alive in me. And that's actually, first off, physically true. Literally, right? Cosmogenesis, the entire evolutionary process, is recapitulated in embryogenesis, right? All of the previous levels of evolution quite literally live in me, interiors and exteriors. It's all living in me. And when I awaken to the realization that evolution lives in me, that's conscious evolution. Not gorgeous?
Mm.
Right? And I had a big argument with my dear friend who I invoked earlier, Barbara Marks Hubbard, in the last years of her life, which we came to a full agreement on, right, before she passed. And we've done, dialogues about it. It's not just, oh, right, she passed, she agreed with me. Right?
Yeah.
And, Barbara, I wouldn't do that to you, my love, right? And we dialogued about it publicly. Barbara used to talk about conscious evolution as evolution becoming aware of itself in the human being, right? Up to now, she said it was evolution by chance. And that she wrongly adapted and regretted. We talked about it deeply, kind of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was the world was by chance. We've long rejected that, right, at the leading edges of science, although it's still part of the standard, common narrative, and science hasn't yet caught up with itself, and that needs to happen. But that's actually not true. In other words, when evolution generated photosynthesis, I could spend a day just talking about photosynthesis, but it's the most stunning, you know, elaborate. Elaborate's not, I can't use the word elaborate. It's exponentially beautiful. It's exponentially complex. It's exponentially dazzling in the amount that's happening, right, in the photosynthesis, right? It's just so beyond imagination. If you want to you go up online and just bring up even an E. coli bacteria and look what's happening there. And you'll just be like dazzled by the complexity and the movements of intimacy and the configurations. Now, exponentialize that, you get photosynthesis. All that's happening way before there's a human neocortex. All right, but evolution was doing that by chance, unconsciously. Not likely. Not likely. It's just impossible. That has nothing to do with intelligent design. That's not a Christian intelligent design idea that there's a God outside the cosmos, right, who has, right, a plan that's being, puppeteered. No, it's actually a much more fascinating and beautiful reality in which we understand that reality is both held in a larger intelligence, and that larger intelligence inheres in reality. That larger intelligence is an inherent process of reality itself. It's the ceaseless inherent creativity of cosmos, which is reaching towards, right, its own inherent plot lines. And that has a lot to do with where are we, which is the love story of the universe, and why we're saying that. That's our where are we question, the second question. So I'm going to bracket that for a second. But evolution, right, is this process that's alive in me. So I literally am evolution. That's actually true. I don't. We talk about evolution in school as a theory. Evolution is not a theory. Evolution is my identity,
Mhm.
right? I am the personal face of the evolutionary impulse. And when I awaken to that realization, that's conscious evolution. It's not that evolution was unconscious and then the human being came along, right, at a particular stage in history right now, and it became conscious. Well, that actually ignores everything that happened before the human being. Right? Actually, evolution clearly was in some sense intelligent consciousness, right, to generate photosynthesis and to generate the entire evolutionary process, right, of unimaginable, dazzling, mathematical, genius and complexity, right, all before the human neocortex. So the human being, right, human being awakens, and then the human being goes through all these stages of evolution. But then at some point, the human being becomes aware, and that point is now, becomes aware of the entire evolutionary story. Wow, that's new. We've never been aware of the entire evolutionary story and then been able to locate ourselves in that story, to realize that we're part of that story, that we're actually expressions of that story. That story is happening through us. We're its storytellers. We're also writing its next chapters. That's conscious evolution.
Yeah,
That's
and,
stunning.
and evoking story is important as well because my dear friend Ted Decker, when I was asking him, and he's a amazing storyteller, sold over 10 million books, and
Yay.
he said, "Look, story is really simple. It's a series of things that happen to a character or characters that cause them to transform. That is a series. It's the transformation of
Right.
characters in a story,
So,
right? And so that's it. That's what we're participating in.
Yes. And this is big. And I'm going to, with permission, allow you to seduce me only partially here, right? Because as you know, my wicked friend, right? There's a lot to say about story,
Yes,
right?
and we're going to say it,
And we're
just
gonna,
not
and we're gonna
just
say
not
it.
today.
Just not today. But let's just because you threw that sentence in, let's just go back for a second, okay? So the pre-personal self, right, doesn't have its own story. It's part of the larger story. The baby is part of the mother's story. There's no differentiation of an individuated story. Separate self begins to realize, oh, I have a story. False self is a distortion of that story. That story gets distorted. It's a distorted plot line. Then you get to true self, and true self actually, which is why most true self teachers say move beyond your story. No, don't get stuck in your story, right? Your story is actually extra. It's a problem, right? Get to this place where you're beyond story. Unique self then returns story. Unique self says, no, your ego story is limited, true but partial. You got to move beyond story. You're part of the larger story of a cosmos, not just the story of consciousness, the story of desire. You're a unique expression of the story of desire. You are your deepest heart's desire as part of this larger story of desire. So we bring story back on in unique self. We actually reclaim the dignity of story. And then in evolutionary unique self, you realize your story is chapter and verse in the larger story of the cosmos. Right?
Which is a love story.
Now, which is a love story.
And we'll get to that too.
Which is, and that's our second question about where are we? And just for those listening and saying, oh, wow, they're just saying it's a love story. No. I've spent the last, and Aubrey and I have been in deep conversation the last 25 years, right, on kind of understanding this notion of reality as a love story, this amorous cosmos. And that's actually, we're going to show that it's actually the most validated empirically and based on all the information we have, the best way to understand cosmos, right, on all levels. So it's a very big claim, and we're going to show that claim to be, in the end, self-evidently obvious and beautiful and stunning, and the realization that we live in this amorous cosmos, in this intimate universe, in this cosmorotic universe. But just for now, let's go back. We just showed story through all the levels of self. What we're going to actually talk about when we talk about where are we, we're going to actually show that this notion of reality as a story is even before the human being. That reality itself, the whole thing, has a narrative arc. That story is a quality of reality itself. That just like evolution, a series of transformations, just like uniqueness, right? Just like Eros, our first principles and first values of cosmos, story itself, the narrative arc, is actually a first principle and first value of cosmos. And what that means, we'll get to in a kind of deep way. But I hope, friends, we've earned your trust in that, we say that rigorously, right? Not, it's not casual. Having said that, right, since we're just about 3 hours in, let's get to evolutionary unique self. We just explained evolutionary unique self, at least in broad brush terms. I am evolution. Now, evolution is desire, right? I'm the personal face of the evolutionary desire, but not any desire. I've got to clarify my desire, not my surface desire, not my ego's casual desire, right? But actually, my deepest heart's desire is the desire of evolution. My deepest heart's desire is God desiring through me, right? In other words, you and I talked about yesterday in a different context of study, we talked about what does it mean to love God? It's to let God see through your eyes, and it's to let God desire through you. In other words, if I actually understand that there's a field, there's a God field, God's both a personal force and the quality of the entire field, the infinity of personhood, the infinity of intimacy, which is, again, a different conversation. But if I actually have that realization, which is a deep realization, which we'll get to in a different conversation, then I actually realize, oh, I'm a unique expression of that field. That's a very big deal. So if reality is desire, which is actually how the interior sciences understand it, how I can find it anthropologically, because everything that drives me is desire, right? And how evolutionary science understands it, right? Right? Evolution desires, right, to advance in novelty. Evolution is reaching for new emergence. It's reaching for more consciousness and more complexity and more creativity and more uniqueness, all plot lines of cosmos, right? If I actually get that, then I get, oh, so if I'm evolution and I clarify my desire and I actually awaken to knowing that evolution's moving through me, meaning I've awakened from unconscious evolution to conscious evolution, which means I've now awakened from unconscious uniqueness to conscious uniqueness. I realize that my unique desire is the unique desire of evolution, that evolution's desiring through me, then it's really important to clarify what's my true deepest heart's desire. Now that really matters because I am the leading edge of evolution, right? That I am, you can imagine evolution as being 50-50 on the scale, and my desire tips the whole scale, right? So my clarified heart's desire is the desire of divinity discreetly expressed as me, uniquely. Divinity can't desire that next step other than through me. I am, my deepest heart's desire is the desire of evolution because evolution is just another word for desire. Evolution is evolutionary desire. So I am the unique incarnation of evolutionary desire. As such, I can begin to play my instrument. Number 7, drum roll. I guess I shouldn't quit my job and become a drummer. I got that. Okay, so it wasn't such a good drum roll. Chanting. Stay with chanting. Got it. Okay, stay with chanting. So as evolutionary unique self, I participate in unique self symphony. Wow. And unique self symphony means unique self symphony is the new structure of evolutionary intimacy. Reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies. That's a big sentence, which we're going to have to validate in a different dialogue. But a reality is more and more intimacy, wider and wider fields of shared identity. And as we get to this new level, this new human level of evolutionary intimacy, I realize I'm not in a world which is rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, but I'm also not in a world which is just organismic, where we all kind of become part of the kind of one mind, which is a kind of totalitarian notion. Actual reality is a unique self-symphony. And if I'm actually living my unique self and my evolutionary unique self, then I have an instrument to play in the unique self-symphony. There's a song I can sing. There's a poem I can write. There's a way of living, laughing, loving that's uniquely mine and mine alone as I listen to the music, the instruments of everyone else in the symphony, because that's the way you play in a symphony. I'm deeply attuned, literally attuned to the field, right? I hear all the other instruments, and yet I'm distinctly playing my instrument. It's a unique self-symphony, but it's not just a unique self-symphony. It's not just that I'm playing Beethoven's score uniquely, which is what a symphony does. It's a unique self-jazz symphony.
Yeah, it's like, or like a Grateful Dead when they're just finished at the end of the song and they got 20 minutes just riffing off each other and feeling the vibe of the audience and playing their music.
That's right. And Garcia picks up his guitar and Hot Damn, right? And there we go, and we're spinning, right? Right? It's happening, right? And so a jazz symphony means, and when you watch jazz, it's so beautiful. There's this moment where the trombone steps back, right? Everyone steps back, and maybe you got the clarinet, whoever you've got playing, and all of a sudden they're playing. And they're playing something that's never been played before. That's undeniably original, irreducibly new. It's an emergent, right? It's an emergent because that's what reality does. Reality generates new emergence. I'm a new emergent of reality, and I have a unique gift to give. I have a poem to write, a song to sing, right? A way of laughing, living, and being that's actually needed by all that is. That's a contribution. It's my verse to contribute. That's the jazz symphony. That's who I am. That's what it means to play my instrument, because I'm a unique incarnation of Eros. Now, what we've described here, Aubrey, is a new political structure. It's a new economic structure, right? It's a new social structure. In other words, reality doesn't need to be run by a command and control top-down impositional framework, right? Which is what those...
One composer, a bunch of instruments.
Which is...
Following directions like robots.
Which is precisely what those proponents of closed societies are claiming, that the only way we can organize, right, a society which is going to have 10 billion people by the end of the century, then it's, by the way, going to go through a precipitous drop for lots of reasons, but you can't organize 10 billion people. We have to have a command and control top-down, one composer. Everyone's told what instrument to play. No, you actually can create an open society. Now, open societies as they exist today are going to dissolve. They're going to disappear and disintegrate because they have no organizing principles. And organizing principle means, now this is the whole, everything was for this. Organizing principle means you can create not complicated systems, which are alienated from each other, which are lost in rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, which generate fragility. You can create complex systems, David Snowden's distinction, meaning a complex system means that the whole system actually operates in resonance. And the way I understand a complex system, which Snowden doesn't say, but he agrees with, is that a complex system means there's allurement between the parts, right? They're in resonance with each other. So a complex system is self-organizing. So it's very beautiful. It's self-actualizing. We're beginning to describe a self-actualizing society in which, so an anthill, every ant knows what to do. How do ants know what to do? So we're not sure. So we started to look for the command ant. That was what early research did. We couldn't find the command ant. Or we started looking slime molds for the pacer cells that were telling, slime mold that moves through the forest floor, then splits into separate cells, then comes back together. We tried to understand how does it do that. So we looked for the pacer cell. There was a 1962 article by Schaefer out of Harvard that everyone assumed there's a general someplace. We just can't identify the general because he's hiding too well. And then we realized Evelyn Fox Keller's research, based on Turing's morphogenesis at Bell Lab, began to realize, no. Actually, there's simple rules that generate, right, the inherent process of self-organization in a slime mold